Hey guys, how's it going? Coach Wesson here with Good Lift Performance. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about load management. This is a topic that I think gets very narrowly looked at in terms of injury rehabilitation, but it has a much larger scope. And so I want to dive deep into the different topics of load management, what that looks like, and how to properly use it. But before we get into today's video, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of my powerlifting videos that I drop, as well as make sure to hit that like button if you like the video, and drop a comment down below on what your favorite part of the video is. All right, let's get into today's topic. All right, so load management. So load management is basically just how it sounds. It is the coach, or if the athlete's writing their own training, right? Whoever's writing the training, it's how they manage the workload, which is, you think about like the sets, the reps, and then the weight being used, how that is managed across not only just the week of training, but how that is progressed over the block or the training cycle, which is, multiple blocks put together. Why load management is really important is because often narrowly talked about with injury rehabilitation or injury prevention, where acute injuries are often associated with big spikes in workload very quickly before the body can adapt to them, or it is having too high of a workload for too long and then your body becomes injured in that way. Overuse standpoint, think about as a chronic injury. There is a study, or maybe multiple studies out there, I don't remember exactly, but basically it talks about how when you are looking at your load management or your weekly volume, which is your sets, your reps, and your weight, that over the course of a block or about a month, I think the study actually was about 4 weeks, that's what it was talking about, that you shouldn't see a rise in your week 1 training numbers compared to your week 4 training numbers more than a 1.5 increase. So if you were to take the total tonnage of your squat work, your bench work, or your deadlift work in terms of your sets times reps times weight, that's going to give you a number in the thousands. If you take that and multiply that number by 1.5, that is the upper limit of how much you should be progressing your lift from week 1 to week 4. Now, if you actually look at that number in terms of how much people progress, it's actually usually much lower than 1.5. 1.5 is a pretty big increase, which is why that's sort of the upper limit of what you should be doing from block to block. A lot of times it ends up being like 1.2, 1.3, somewhere in that range. And if you look at the actual tonnage from week to week, it doesn't change that much because realistically we're only adding, 5, 10 pounds per week, something to that effect. Or maybe if you're a bigger lifter, maybe you're adding more like 15 to 20 pounds per week. But, it's not these huge fluctuations, right? And should reflect that we aren't really going above a 1.5 from week 1 to week 4 or whatever to the end of the block. And that's not necessarily a hard and fast rule. At least I never have thought about it as a hard or fast rule. Rather, I think about that as a good rule of thumb of making sure that you don't overdo the progression on your either your main lifts or your accessories. Like you can just as easily do it on accessories where maybe, hey, we're starting off with 3 sets on all of our accessories, and then we bump it up to 4 sets, and then by the end of block it's up to 5 sets. Well, that's almost a 50% increase. That'd be around that 1.5, and that could definitely push you to that upper limit of what you can actually recover from. And so the big reason why we look at load management and when it's relating to injury is we want to make sure that we are not just paying attention to the muscles, but the tendons and the ligaments. Those are really the big one. Those are your knees, your elbows, your shoulders, and then the soft tissues inside of those, the tendons, which connect everything together. And so those soft tissues they're not going to adapt at the same rate as your muscles will. And so it's important that we cognizant of how fast we are progressing so that we can keep the athlete healthy, especially those soft tissues. Now, it's more of an issue on the untested side where we have rapid strength gain because, the performance-enhancing drugs are going to more rapidly improve your muscular strength faster than your tendon and ligament strength because the performance-enhancing drugs don't really help accelerate the soft tissues, but it does help accelerate the musculature. And so that's usually where the muscle will outpace the tendons and ligaments. And that happens less in terms of just raw strength improvements with a natural lifter, but rather it has to do more with the workload of adding too much work in too quickly or progressing the weight too fast over a training cycle and your body not being able to handle it. Especially when you start getting into those high exertion sets, when you're doing too high of exertion too often, too frequently, that can definitely kind of use up the gas tank in terms of your tissue tolerance, because essentially your tissues, your tendons and ligaments, and even your muscles have a certain tolerance of how much stress they can handle. And as you get stronger, they will adapt and be able to handle more stress. Or like when we do a work capacity block, it's because we need your tissues to be able to handle more stress, because you need more stress in order to progress. And so you kind of have to lay the foundation of, we have to get your tendons and ligaments prepared to handle the greater amount of workload that we need in order to progress. And so oftentimes when you are trying to increase your work capacity, you're using very light weights and increasing the sets and the reps so that you're not pushing both volume and intensity at one time. And then you can start to layer in the intensity so that now you kind of lay that foundation with lighter weight before putting on the heavier weight. Because you're trying to do higher volume and higher intensity at the same time, your body will probably not like that, and that will probably increase the risk of injury. Because most studies, when we look at injuries, the only way we can factually point to in terms of injury is mostly just load management, of doing too much too quickly or too much over time and not having a reduction in training volume to allow recovery. This is outside of any technique considerations that might affect your ability to handle workload. This is purely just from a workload sense. So that's why we want to look at these things when we're both trying to manage training to prevent injury, and also when we're trying to build back from injury. And so I've had the pleasure of working with a handful of athletes who have come to me injured, and I've helped them get back to a healthy status, a healthy condition, and get back onto the platform and hit PRs. And the thing that I see a lot is, when they come to me, it's because their programming was really jank. It was, going too hard too often, or it was just way too much work, or some combination of those two. That's what I definitely see a lot when I'm helping people, rehab. And so when I, especially when I talk about rehab on, my Instagram, when I'm doing meet recaps, that's mostly just me helping them manage their training load and maybe improve technique if there's a certain mechanical quality of their lift that seems to cause pain. It's helping them rebuild their lift if that is the case, but more it's helping them manage their loading so that they can still make progress but not work into ranges that would hurt them. Oftentimes if the athlete needs specific rehabilitation drills or exercises, stuff like that, that's where I would refer out to a physical therapist, because that is out of my scope of practice. As a powerlifting coach, the one thing that I can do is I can give warm-ups just to help with basic preparing you for training. I can manage the training load so that it is a healthy amount for the athlete that allows them to progress pain-free as much as we can. And I can help them with any technique stuff that might be causing pain. But in terms of actually diagnosing or prescribing specific rehabilitation exercises or drills or anything like that, that is what I leave to the professionals. So I just wanted to make that clear that when I talk about rehabilitating, I'm mostly talking about me manipulating their training volume. That's the primary thing I'm usually talking about when talking about rehabbing the athletes that I've had the pleasure of working with. And so, not to get too deep into this topic, but if we have an athlete who they are coming off of an injury where they can't train and exercise without pain, the place we want to start with that, because we don't want to take just completely rest it or ignore that lift. That's not a great way to go about it, because you're going to let the injury heal, yes, but you're going to lose a lot of strength that way, but also it's going to take longer to heal, but it won't it doesn't heal in the right way to where it can, as soon as you start to ramp back up, you could still potentially have that injury re-flare up. So you want to try to, when you're rehabbing it, you want to try to use exercises that allow you to train that range of motion, kind of rebuild back the strength of the tissue, because that's how we can fully rehab the athlete back to a healthy state where they're more than likely not going to re-injure the area, right? So that starts with either using a partial range of motion where you can find a range of motion that's pain-free, or if it's a load, finding a load that's pain-free. Some people, it's a certain amount of weight on the bar will cause pain, or for others it's a certain range of motion, or maybe it's a combination of the two. So you want to start by finding an exercise that a variation that you can train pain-free. So if it's like we're having back pain in the squat, maybe doing a high box squat that looks like a quarter squat or a half squat. If that's the range of motion we can train pain-free, great, let's start there. And then find a weight that we can train pain-free. So kind of finding out, all right, where is a good weight range here that allows us to make progress but also not feel pain, or at least very minimal pain. Then that's where you want to start. And then from there, you want to progress either the weight or the range of motion. Ultimately, you want to progress the range of motion more quickly, or at least that's the ultimate goal, because we want to get back to that full range of motion, right? But sometimes it takes a little bit for that range of motion to come back. And so it's easier to focus on progressing the weight first. And then once we can build up strength in that higher range of motion, we can then drop the range of motion, bring the weight back down, now increase our strength out of that lower range of motion, and they can kind of rinse and repeat that cycle until we get the athlete back to their full competition range of motion, and then we can start rebuilding their strength from there. And so that's kind of your starting point, right? And then in terms of getting the athlete back to where they were, we want to do that in a systematic fashion, or a logical progression. And so like the way I was taught how to do this, and I'll give credit to Rory Megan or Roy Alter. I think her actual name is Roy Alter. She goes by, social media kind of goes by both, and I never actually fully asked her to clarify which one is the correct one, but I think it's Roy Alter of PR's Performance. I was coached by her for a long time, as well as I took some of her courses. And the thing with managing load when helping an athlete rehab is you want to do it slow and steady. Slow and steady wins the race. It might feel slow at the time, but the slower you can build an athlete back, the more likely they're going to stay healthy. The faster you build them back, the more likely they are to hurt themselves again from making too big of a jump. And so it's really simple, but just adding 10 pounds or 5 to 10 pounds a week to the athlete or to the lift is a lot of progress, especially if you're doing that lift multiple times a week. That will start to add up really fast, and that allows you to make lots of sustainable progress. Like I've helped a lot of athletes recently who've had back issues. They come to me with back issues. They can't deadlift and they're training very well. What I do, like just to be perfectly honest, is we start off with a really light weight that we can do for pain-free. We do 3 sets of 5, and I add 10 pounds a week until that starts getting relatively hard, and then we'll go to adding maybe like 5 pounds a week, or maybe we'll drop it down to sets of 3, something like that. It's very like starting strength like, but it works really, really well, because essentially it's, instead of making these huge jumps, right, we are just slowly like testing the water at each kind of 10-pound increment of, all right, is this pain-free? Great, go up 10 next week. Great, go up 10 next week, right? And so if we can do that slowly, it actually will add up pretty fast. Yeah, we're not adding 20 pounds or 30 pounds at a time, which we probably could, but that'll get us there faster, but our likelihood of falling back off or retweaking something is much, much higher, versus if we just do it in that slow, systematic fashion. That allows us, in my experience, that's allowed athletes to stay healthy for, like, after we get through that kind of rebuild process. We usually don't have an issue again after that. It's because we took the time to rebuild their deadlift and rebuild tissue tolerance and strength in each of those little 10-pound increments. It's almost like leveling up in a video game. We keep going level by level and step by step up the staircase to get back to where they were. And so we want to do that, and we also want to use, as I mentioned, like with deadlift, right? It was just 3 sets of 5. We want to use a more minimum effective dose. And the reason we want to do that is because, assumingly if we're injured and we're rebuilding after an injury, we are covering ground that we had already had, right? We're regaining strength that we had already previously had. So a common misconception is that we should try to get back to the old training volume that we were doing previously before we got injured, when in reality it's that training volume probably got you injured. And so what I try to tell my athletes is that when we are rebuilding, we are just trying to find your new level of optimal. I could care less about what your old numbers are. It's what is your new level. You're essentially a new athlete after you rehab. You have maybe not necessarily a surgery, but you have new considerations that we need to adapt to. So we're trying to find a new level of optimal. So we're going to start off with a very minimum effective dose, and then we're going to build up from there. And so by doing that, we will be able to regain strength easier than we gained it initially with less volume, because you're regaining it. It's like muscle memory. Your nervous system has already been through those adaptations. You're just regaining them. And so we can cover that ground with a lot less volume than it initially took to get there, which is great. So we kind of want to write out that, slow, steady progression with a minimum effective dose until we can get either back to where we were or back or very close back to where we were. And oftentimes with a lot of my lifters, we've gotten to the point where we're hitting, all-time PRs with this new minimum effective dose before that even ends up running out, which it won't last forever for sure, but it actually gets us very, very far, as long as you're willing to play the long game. And so we're going to do that minimum effective dose. We're going to get them as far back as we can, doing slow, steady progressions. And then once that starts to run out, then that's when we can start making the minimum effective dose change of, all right, what's the next thing we can do in order to progress the lift, so that we can add a little bit more training stress to continue driving up the lift. Now, an important distinction that I make is, I've kind of mentioned that's a very starting strength model-esque approach. Now, starting strength in that more typical model would run athletes through a 5-pound progression until they hit a 10 RPE or an 11 RPE, and then they'll make the change, right? Versus the way I think about it is, I'm going to go until they hit about an 8 RPE, right? Because there's no reason to push them past that like super hard exertion. Once it starts getting hard, we know, okay, this is probably running out. Because as soon as the RPE starts to climb, we know, okay, you're no longer making progress. You're more just adding weight, and the RPE will go up with it. We know we're making progress as long as the RPE stays the same or goes down as we add weight to the bar. So once the RPE starts to climb, we know, okay, it's time to make a change. And so from there, we can make the minimum effective dose change, which can differ depending on the athlete. A lot of times for me, that's adding in an RDL on a second day, because I think if you're a conventional puller, if you only pull once a week, it's probably a good idea to do an RDL on a second day, maybe not like a full deadlift on the second day, but at least an RDL. So that's usually where I'll start. I'll add in an RDL on a second day so we can kind of get like a 1.5 frequency. And then from there, we can play around with adding more sets to, we'll try that, see if that works. And then from there, we can try adding in more sets to the that actual competition deadlift day, the primary day, go from there and kind of either add more volume, or we can change the RDL to a secondary competition deadlift day down the road, or a pause variation or a different variation, right? So it goes like, go to add in the RDL, start adding in sets on the main day, and then adding in or replacing the RDL with a variation, or just adding another variation on top of the RDL for low sets and low reps. And then we can start building up. If that still doesn't work, then we can add in more sets to that secondary day, and keeping the secondary day very light and not pushing it, because assuming we're going to be pushing that primary day. And so we want to layer on the stress. So basically, if you look at that, it's very much minimum effective dose, and then once that stops working, then we start making minimum effective dose changes to the program, and we start layering on stress. We want to try to find that optimal range. We don't just want to like jump super far ahead and be like, oh, once a week stopped working, now we need to go to 2 times a week deadlifting. Like, there's lots of little progressions in there that will allow us to continue making progress and kind of find there might be the optimal range in between there. Like, yeah, maybe the athlete does need twice a week deadlift, because there's definitely been athletes who I've worked with who need that second deadlift session, but not checking to see if a lower stress strategy will work is negligent, in my opinion, because we're not covering our bases. We're not leaving no stone unturned, right? If you're just jumping up in stress and not layering it on strategically, then we're doing the athlete a disservice. We want to do this in a very systematic fashion. So that's sort of a bird's eye view of how I go approaching like helping an athlete rehab. It's minimum effective dose with a steady progression, and then once that stops working, and by stop working, it's the exertion starts to rise with the load, then we start making minimum effective dose changes. Now, let's say the athlete is, they're already healthy, right? And we need to increase how much training they're doing, increase their work capacity, because now we need to do more work in order to progress, right? So that's maybe where we need to do a work capacity block to improve our work capacity, so now we can start doing more work and recover from it to drive more progress. A good example of this is bench press, where bench press is probably the lift that goes through the most changes in terms of your weekly frequency. And so if you're going, say, from twice a week to 3 times a week, that's where you want to be more strategic, or like 3 to 4, right? 4 to 5. You want to be strategic in how you're adding in that additional day. You don't just want to add in a full third bench day and say, good luck, have fun. You want to do it in a systematic way. So when we are trying to improve, we're trying to increase our work capacity, right? Or we're trying to increase our lifting frequency, which is most of the time when we're talking about work capacity, and I'll make a separate video on work capacity because I think it's its own topic, but most of the time when we're talking about increasing work capacity, it's mostly due to we need to increase our frequency of doing a lift. And so we want to have a sort of a foundational block or a work capacity block that allows us to add in that extra day with really easy work before loading up that third day or whatever that additional day ends up being number-wise for you. So we want to start off. A good idea is to take whatever your normal training volume is in terms of sets and split that up from 2 days to 3 days. That's a really good place to start. And oftentimes just making that adjustment might be enough. I actually had a lifter where our total working sets actually went down, even though we went from 2 days to 3 days, because that third day, they needed less overall work to progress. And when we tried to do the same amount of work, actually ended up being too much for them. It was because obviously they had less days to recover between each bench session. And so they actually needed less total work, and now they're making the same amount of progress. So it's funny where people think, oh, it's work capacity. We're going to be doing ultimately more sets if we go up in frequency. But oftentimes just changing the frequency but keeping the same sets can be enough. But that isn't always the case. So the good place to start there is just take that same set count you've been doing, split over 3 days, and then do that for about 4 weeks. Assuming that everything's good to go, there's no pain or anything like that, everything's good to go, then we can now you can either up the volume in terms of adding an additional set or sets, right? Let's say you're doing 4 sets over 2 days, or you're doing 4 sets each day, so that was 8 sets, right? Now you're gonna go to 3 days, try 3 sets across. That could be 9 total sets over the 3 days, or you could do 3, 3, and 2. So that would be the 8 sets, right? You could try that, and then if that's working well, then maybe you add in an additional set on the primary day. So now it's the top set and 3 down sets, and then there's 3 sets and then 2 sets, right? Something to that effect. But still, it's kind of that same thing as when we're trying to rehab the athlete. It's making that minimum effective dose change of, all right, this training stress isn't enough. Let's turn the dial a little bit to start making progress. Is that enough? No. Okay, we need to make a bigger turn. All right, still not enough? All right, make the next turn, right? We want to make the smallest change to the program to see what change actually causes the progress. Because as I mentioned with the injury stuff, if we're making these big changes when there's lots of little changes in between that we could have made, we don't know if that big change was necessary, if we could have gotten away with a smaller change, right? And when we're doing those bigger changes, you're once again putting the athlete at more risk because you are making them do more than they would potentially have to do in order to make the progress we'd want to see. And so with that, one of the biggest differences between the rehab and then the pushing for work capacity or pushing for the athlete to make more progress is, with the rehab stuff, we want to use that more minimum effective dose. But with the pushing performance, yes, we're making a minimum effective dose change, but we're not using a minimum effective dose protocol. We are trying to, it's more of like the middle of the bell curve, where if, the left side of the bell curve is the minimum effective dose, the middle of the bell curve is sort of that optimal zone, and then the right side of that bell curve is the maximum recoverable volume. We generally want to be somewhere in the middle there. And so we're using the smallest effective change to find the optimal zone, not just the minimum effective dose volume. Because a lot of times the minimum effective dose volume is the smallest incremental progress we can make, which for a competitive powerlifter might not be enough progress. So we want to still be strategic about the changes we're making, but we're still have our foot on the gas when it comes to training in terms of training volume, because we are still trying to make good progress, right? So that we aren't falling behind our competition. And besides being what I would call negligent of doing too much to drive progress when we could have done less, we're also avoiding increasing our acute workload too much to where when we're making those minimum effective dose changes those changes are more than likely not going to cause your acute workload to be, a 1.5 compared to your chronic workload, right? We're not going to reach into that upper limit of change that's we've seen is healthy for athletes. And so not only are we finding the optimal zone, but we're also reducing the risk of doing too much that would cause a potential injury. So that's why it's very important to make those small effective changes, as well as, just reiterating, then we actually know what we're doing and why we're doing it and that it works. So that's the injury management side of load management, which is the side that most people are the most familiar with. The other part of load management that doesn't get talked about as much, it's similar to the pushing the progress side of it, which is how do you manage the workload in order to just make progress, but not in a way that's increasing frequency, right, or increasing set count. It's how do you progress the weight from week to week. And so there's lots of different progression models, stuff like that, right? And I was inspired to do this video in part because I've seen these memes going around which makes fun of the sort of starting strength model of just add 5 pounds or add 10 pounds per week and you'll be good to go. It's made fun of because of its simplicity, because training can't be that simple of just adding 5 pounds every week. That's too easy. It needs to be more complicated than that. And the thing that I always try to iterate is that if you are an athlete, especially if you're more on the novice to early intermediate side, and you can literally just add 5 to 10 pounds to your working sets each week and you can make progress, right, where the RP doesn't jump up dramatically, it like stays the same. Why wouldn't you do that? That is the simplest form of progression. Add weight to the bar, keep going. Add weight to the bar, keep making progress. That is literally the easiest thing you could do. And if you could do it, why wouldn't you do that? It's the simplest form of progression there is. And I've mentioned this in other videos, we only need to get more complicated when simple progressions don't work. But I think a lot of people want to go to the more complicated progressions too soon because that's what like advanced level lifters have to do, right? And that's the cool thing. They look at what are the best lifters in the world doing right now, and like that's what we should do, versus looking at, well, how do they get there? I can guarantee you they weren't doing this complicated wave loading, intricate periodization type of stuff. They were just like going to the gym and trying to add weight to the bar every week. And then once that stopped working, then they added more planning to it. And that's what I'm really getting at here is that, like, especially with the way I like to program for like with down sets, right, where I like to use a percentage of 1 rep max to the block, and we're going to steadily add weight to the bar, usually in 1 to 2% increments. 2.5% for some lifters can be actually quite a lot. That can be like 15 pounds. 15 to 20, which is a lot. I like doing either 1 or 2% increments. So usually just a 5 or 10 pound progression because it's slow enough to where you can add weight to the bar and it's generally not going to make the RP rise a ton. Like over the course of 4 weeks, yeah, the RP will rise a little bit, but not a ton. But it allows it literally shows that, hey, we are making progress from week to week instead of just having to do the same loads week to week. You get to add a little bit of weight each week, right? And then works really well. It's almost like, I hate using this phrase, but it's the best way I can describe it. It's almost like forcing adaptation. It is, I'm going to make you stronger by putting more weight on the bar and making you do it. Because a lot of times we can actually do a lot more than we think we're capable of. And not, especially with down sets, they're usually not even that hard, right? A lot of times they are going to be in that 6 to 7 range, and people are like, oh no, it should feel like a 5. It should feel really easy. Well, not all the time. So if we can add just 5 or 10 pounds every single week within a block, and then at the end of the block we wave load back down or we deload, change the rep range a little bit, and then work our way back up, that is a fantastic way to continue to make progress. It's the simplest form, right? And I think it gets a lot of shit for being simplistic, but my philosophy there is keep the training as simple as it can be, because we only need to make it more complex if it needs to be. The more complex the training is, the harder to truly figure out if it's working or not, because you have more moving pieces. If we can literally just have a single week of training and you can just repeat that week and continually add weight to the bar, why wouldn't we do that? I guarantee you, if you go ask any advanced lifter if they would rather A, have this complicated, programming where they only get to add a little bit of weight to the bar every couple months, or every like 6 months, or if they would take adding 5 pounds to the bar each week and being able to make progress, they're going to take the latter. They're going to take the easier route, because it's, even though it's simple and it's not as sexy, it works really well, and you can see tangible results by doing it, or you tangibly see the weight on the bar progressing and going up. And so I think that oftentimes gets overlooked of simplicity. Like sometimes the best answer is the easiest one, right? Or the simplest one. And people overlook that all the time. So that's part of what inspired me to make this video, because I've been seeing that meme going around, and I'm like, that obviously he's just trying to get a reaction out of people like me, so it worked. But if people truly see that and go, yeah, that's dumb, just adding 5 pounds each week doesn't work, I'm like, have you ever tried it? Because trust me, it works really well. I do that with the majority of my athletes. It's really simple. You just start with a light weight, you add weight to the bar each week, and they get stronger. It's a miracle, right? No, it's just progressive overload. And not to beat a dead horse, but when you go about training with just adding the goal of adding 5 to 10 pounds per week, and then once you can't do that anymore, you deload and change the rep range, you will very often avoid reaching that, overdoing the acute workload, right? Because you're just steadily adding work every single week, or adding weight to the bar every single week, and by the time you get to the end of the block from any one week, it's not a huge progression, but and so it ends up being, you end up very easily avoiding injury that way, right? Because there's not these huge changes from week to week, which also, like, if you have a huge reduction in training and then a huge increase again, that can also be a way of like having these huge fluctuations in the program is generally not great, which is why I'm a big advocate for percentage-based down sets, working sets with RPE-based top sets, because having one top set per that day is not going to change the workload dramatically, but having a steady RPE-based prescription is that baseline that allows us to continue to make progress, and is that it builds the strength for the top set, right? And it is a consistent stimulus that will always be there and doesn't go up and down. It's a consistent variable, or an independent variable, which I've mentioned in my previous videos. And just to quickly touch on the chronic part of it, we've been talking a lot about like the acute workload from week to week. We're talking about chronic workload management. This is more talking about when do we need to deload and when do we need to cycle, in a sense of we need to bring the weights back down, which is sort of like when you look at a training cycle, it always is going to, or usually it's going to build up to a peak where you're going to be, like, say you're doing triples the block, first block, doubles second block, singles last block. It's ramping up so the intensity is rising with the down sets, even though that intensity is rising, and it kind of reaches a peak where, all right, if we push past this, we're not going to have any more room to go. And so that's when you need to then cycle back down to the higher reps or the lower weight, or let's say you're using more of a consistent model from block to block where it's not drastically changing, but maybe just the top sets are changing, right? Then we're just cycling back to your higher rep top sets, but maybe the down sets are the same. And it's sort of like instead of like a hypertrophy strength peaking, it could be more just like an early, middle, and late cycle, like a 1, 2, 3, where you sequence them in a specific way so that they're very similar, but they're only periodizing maybe the top set, right? Something like that. And so when you're doing that, making sure you have deloads in between those, or deloads at the end of each block, so that you have reductions in training so that you can recover, right? That's because we need to, chronic issues or injuries are usually caused by too much for too long. And so if you are running hot too often, then that's when you need to cool down and kind of recycle back, right? I think of a peak as like you're continually getting hotter and hotter, right? Your fitness is getting higher and higher, your fatigue's also getting higher and higher, and then you're gonna reach a certain point where you really shouldn't go push past that. And usually that's about 3 to 4 blocks sequenced in a row. When you start sequencing them like that, and they're kind of building off of each other, you can run hot for about 3 to 4 cycles, and where you reach this like peak conditions. And then after that, you need to deload, you need to wash out, you need to cycle back down. Otherwise, if you try just to keep pushing it, that's when a lot of times injuries tend to happen, just because it's too high for too long. And so often, you're going to do that leading into a meet. And then after meet, that's when you see a lot of like pulling back on the training volume a little bit for allowing the athlete to resensitize the training so that you can repeat that process, or just reducing the intensity so that the athlete can resensitize to that and then ramp back up. So because it's important just to have those planned breaks and recovery periods so that you're not going too hot, too long. And that's what can potentially cause injury. So hopefully you made it this far into the video. Make sure you hit that subscribe button so you catch all of my in-depth powerlifting videos. Make sure to hit like button on the video if you liked it, and drop a comment down below if you learned anything from this video. If you have any suggestions for the next video, I would love to hear it in the comment section below as well. Otherwise, I'll talk to you guys next time. Peace.